It's loose! Get back!
Easy now, boy. Easy.
Be careful, it's wild!
Look out! The Stallion's loose! Run, it's Cowboy! It's coming right for us! Get back! Somebody rope it!
We have to go. Now.
What's happening?
No time. Stay close.
I'm with you.
This way. Hurry.
Lead on.
Come on, partner. We're not stopping now.
Look at her go with that black devil horse!
That's it.
Whoa, easy now!
He's spooked! Be careful!
Hold him steady! Easy, boy.
Easy.
That's it. Good boy.
Easy, Diablo, you're safe now. I found you by the river, half-starved. We ain't alone no more.
They laughed at the schoolteacher like she was already buried. Dry Creek smelled like dust, whiskey, and horse sweat that evening, the kind of cold October wind that slipped under a man's coat and stayed there. Lanterns swung above Main Street while fiddles played inside the dance hall, and every unmarried woman in town waited near the floor, hoping some lonely rancher might ask for a dance before the night ended. But Clara Whitmore stood alone beside the lemonade table with both hands wrapped around a paper cup gone warm an hour ago. 34 years old. Too educated. Too quiet. That was what the town said about her when they thought she could not hear. Some called her Old Maid Clara, behind smiles that smelled faintly of coffee and tobacco. Others simply looked away. The younger girls wore bright ribbons and soft perfume shipped in from St. Louis. Clara wore a plain gray dress, buttoned all the way to her throat. Even under the lantern glow, nobody crossed the room for her. A church widow leaned toward another woman near the pie table and whispered, "That one waited too long." The other woman answered, "No man wants a wife smarter than him." Clara heard every word. She always did. But she lowered her eyes and pretended to study the dust near her boots while the music carried on around her. Outside town, Ethan Walker rode in slow with 6 horses trailing behind him, their hooves thudding against the hard earth like distant drums. He was taller than most men in Dry Creek, broad shoulders under a weather-beaten coat, jaw rough with 2 days of beard. Folks knew him as the cowboy who lived alone beyond Miller Ridge with more horses than friends. He rarely came into town unless he needed feed or nails, and he almost never stayed after sunset. But tonight his black stallion Diablo had been restless all week, and Ethan figured the noise of town might burn some of the fire out of the animal. He tied the horses near the dance hall and stepped onto Main Street just as laughter rolled through the open doors. Then he saw her. Clara stood beneath the swinging lantern light, while couples turned in circles behind her like she had become invisible to the whole world. Ethan slowed. Something about the stillness in her face unsettled him more than tears would have. She looked like a woman who had spent years teaching herself not to expect kindness. The wind lifted a loose strand of brown hair near her cheek. For 1 second, Ethan almost walked toward her. But before he could move, a violent crash exploded from the horse rail outside the saloon. Men shouted. Wood snapped. Diablo reared into the lantern glow, eyes wild. Black mane whipping through the cold night air as the giant stallion tore free from the hitching post and sent 2 ranch hands stumbling backward into the dirt. Women screamed and scattered across the street. One man grabbed a rope and missed completely. Another tried to calm the horse only to jump aside when Diablo struck the ground hard enough to shake dust loose from the porch roof. Ethan cursed under his breath and moved fast toward the chaos. But through the panic and flying dirt, he noticed something strange. Clara Whitmore was walking toward the stallion while everybody else was running away. Diablo slammed his front hooves into the dirt hard enough to send dust across Main Street like smoke rolling off a prairie fire. The stallion's black coat glistened under the lantern light while frightened horses pulled against their reins nearby, snorting clouds into the cold night air. Men shouted over each other from the boardwalk. Somebody yelled for a rope. Another man knocked over a barrel, trying to get clear of the animal. But Clara Whitmore kept walking forward 1 slow step at a time, her gray skirt moving gently in the wind while the rest of Dry Creek watched her like she had lost her senses. Ethan reached for Diablo's dangling reins, but the horse jerked sideways again before he could grab hold. The stallion trusted nobody when fear took over. Ethan knew that better than anyone. He had raised the animal from a half-starved colt found near the Arkansas River 3 winters ago. Diablo could outrun any horse in 3 counties, but he carried something wild inside him that never fully settled. Most men called the stallion dangerous. Ethan usually agreed. "Miss Clara," someone shouted from the dance hall porch, "Get away from that thing." She did not answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horse. Calm, steady, like she was listening to something nobody else could hear. Diablo stomped once more, muscles tight beneath his dark skin, breath rising white into the October air. Ethan expected the horse to bolt again. Instead, the stallion froze the moment Clara stepped close enough to touch him. The entire street went silent except for the creaking lantern above the saloon door. Clara lifted one gloved hand slowly toward the horse's neck. No sudden movement, no fear in her face. Her fingertips rested lightly against the black mane while dust drifted around her boots. Diablo shivered beneath her hand. Ethan stared in disbelief. The horse had thrown experienced ranch hands before, yet now the animal lowered his head inch by inch until his breathing softened. Clara leaned close enough to whisper something nobody else could hear. The stallion blinked once, then stood perfectly still beside her like an old farm horse ready for Sunday church. A little girl near the bakery whispered, "How did she do that?" Nobody answered. Ethan could not remember the last time Main Street had gone this quiet. Clara gently gathered the reins and turned toward Ethan without triumph in her eyes. No smile, no pride, just quiet understanding. "He was frightened," she said softly. Ethan looked at Diablo, then back at her. Most folks run from him. Clara glanced toward the dance hall, where people still stood frozen near the windows. Most folks run from anything they do not understand. The words landed harder than Ethan expected. For a second, neither of them moved. Lantern light flickered across Clara's face while the cold wind carried fiddle music out from the dance hall again, like the town itself was slowly waking from a dream. Then one rancher muttered under his breath, "Well, I will be damned." A few nervous laughs followed. The spell broke. People began talking all at once, louder than before. But Ethan barely heard them. He kept watching Clara Whitmore standing beside the most untamable horse in Dry Creek with one hand resting against its neck like she belonged there. And for the first time in years, something unfamiliar settled into the lonely silence inside him. By sunrise the next morning, half the town had already turned Clara Whitmore into a story. Dry Creek always woke early. Wagon wheels creaked across the hard road before dawn. Horses stamped beside the hitching rails, and the smell of bacon grease drifted out from the boarding house kitchen while frost still clung to the edges of windows. But inside the general store, people were talking about only one thing. "I heard that horse nearly dropped to its knees for her." No, they laughed. She whispered something into like she was already buried. Maybe the schoolteacher has some kind of strange dust. Whiskey, men laughed into their coffee that evening, while women kind of cold October near the counter pretending not to listen. Clara entered the store just after 8, carrying a stack of school papers tied with string against her chest. The room quieted for less than a second. Then the whispers started again, softer this time, hidden behind polite smiles. Mr. Grady tipped his hat awkwardly. "Morning, Miss Whitmore." Clara nodded once. "Morning." She walked toward the shelves for lamp oil without lifting her eyes. The strange thing was not the gossip itself. Clara had lived with gossip for years. The strange thing was the way people looked at her now. Not with warmth. Not exactly kindness either. More like confusion. As though they had suddenly discovered the lonely schoolteacher might have been a real woman all along. Outside the store window, Ethan Walker sat on the porch rail beside the barber shop, slowly tightening a leather strap around his saddlebag. He had told himself twice already that morning he only came into town for feed grain. Yet somehow he had been sitting there nearly 20 minutes watching the general store door without admitting why. Diablo stood tied nearby, unusually calm, ears flicking lazily in the cold air. Old Ben Carter stepped onto the porch carrying tobacco and smirked when he noticed Ethan staring toward the window. "You planning to court the schoolmarm now?" Ethan kept working the leather strap. "No," Ben chuckled. "Town says she tamed your devil horse faster than you ever could." Ethan finally looked up. Horse trusted her. Funny thing, Ben said quietly. Sometimes lonely creatures recognize each other. Ethan said nothing after that. He hated how the word stayed with him anyway. Across town, Clara's classroom smelled faintly of chalk dust and pinewood floors warmed by a cast-iron stove. 20 children filled the small room with restless energy while winter clouds gathered slowly outside the windows. Clara moved between desks collecting arithmetic papers, calm as always, though she could still feel the weight of eyes from the general store following her all morning. One little boy near the back raised his hand. Miss Whitmore. Yes, Samuel. Is it true you can tame wild horses? A few children giggled. Clara paused only a moment before answering. No, but sometimes animals calm down when somebody stops being afraid of them. The room fell quiet. Samuel frowned thoughtfully. Then why are grown folks always scared of everything? Several children laughed again, but Clara did not. For a second her expression changed, softening with something close to sadness. Outside the schoolhouse window, she noticed Ethan Walker riding slowly past the road on Diablo. The cowboy glanced toward the classroom only briefly before continuing down the frozen street. Still, Clara watched him disappear between the cottonwood trees longer than she should have. 3 days later, the first hard wind of November rolled across Dry Creek and snapped half the fence posts along Ethan Walker's eastern pasture. The morning sky hung low and gray above the hills while brittle grass bent under the cold. Ethan stood near the broken fence line with a hammer tucked through his belt and a fresh cedar post balanced against one shoulder. Diablo grazed nearby, unusually quiet, steam drifting from his nostrils into the freezing air. Ethan worked alone like always. That was how he preferred things. Silence did not ask questions. Silence did not pity a man for eating supper by himself every night beside an empty chair. He drove one nail into the fence and reached for another when he heard the soft crunch of wagon wheels behind him. Clara Whitmore climbed down from a borrowed farm wagon wrapped in a dark wool coat with 2 spare fence boards resting against her shoulder. Ethan frowned slightly. You lost. Clara shook her head once. Mr. Carter said your fence came down. Ethan glanced at the boards she carried. So children cut across this pasture walking home from school. She stepped closer into the cold wind. If the fence stays broken, they will wander too near the creek bank after dark. Ethan stared at her another moment before taking the boards from her hands. That is a long ride just to worry about schoolchildren. Clara looked toward the open pasture where dry weeds rolled through the grass like tumbleweeds. Somebody should. Ethan did not answer after that. They worked side by side beneath the heavy sky, while the wind carried the smell of pine and frozen dirt across the hills. Clara held posts steady while Ethan hammered them into place. Neither spoke much. The quiet between them felt strangely easy anyway. Around noon, Clara removed her gloves and rubbed warmth back into her fingers near the wagon. Ethan noticed how rough her hands looked for a schoolteacher. Not delicate, not pampered. Hands that had worked for years without complaint. You ever done fence work before? He asked. Clara gave a small shrug. My father owned a farm in Kansas when I was young. Ethan leaned against the post driver. What happened to him? Drought. Her voice stayed calm. Then illness. Ethan nodded slowly. Out on the prairie, a hawk circled beneath the clouds while Diablo wandered closer toward Clara. The stallion lowered his head beside her shoulder, almost protective. Ethan shook his head softly. He does not do that with strangers. Clara brushed the horse's mane gently. Maybe he knows loneliness when he sees it. The words settled heavily into the cold air between them. Ethan looked away first. By late afternoon, only one section of fence remained unfinished. Clara reached for another nail from the toolbox when the wind suddenly lifted her coat, sleeve just enough for Ethan to notice a faded gold ring hanging from a thin chain around her neck. Not worn on her hand. Hidden. Old. He paused. You were married? Clara's expression changed almost too fast to catch. No, she looked down at the ring briefly before tucking it back beneath her collar. I was engaged once. Long ago. Ethan drove another nail quietly into the wood. What happened? Clara watched the empty hills stretching west for miles beneath the pale winter sky. He told me I was difficult to love. The hammer stopped moving in Ethan's hand. Clara smiled faintly after saying it, but there was no bitterness in the smile. That somehow made it sadder. After a long silence, Ethan picked up the final fence board and secured it carefully into place. Then he looked at her for the first time all day without turning away. Sounds to me, he said quietly, like he just did not know much about women. Sunday morning arrived cold and colorless over Dry Creek. Thin frost covered the church steps, while wagon wheels cracked softly across frozen mud outside the chapel. Folks gathered in dark coats carrying Bibles close against their chests as the church bell echoed through town slow and heavy beneath the pale sky. Clara Whitmore sat alone, near the middle pew like she always did, hands folded quietly in her lap, while sunlight pushed weakly through the tall windows behind the pulpit. The women around her smiled politely when she looked their way, but the smiles never lasted long. Ethan Walker rarely attended church anymore, but that morning he stood outside near the hitching rail adjusting Diablo's reins while cigarette smoke drifted from somewhere down the street. He told himself he only stopped to deliver feed grain to the pastor's brother. Yet his eyes kept finding the church windows anyway. Inside, Reverend Miller spoke about kindness and mercy while half the congregation nodded solemnly, like those words belonged neatly inside church walls and nowhere else. After the sermon ended, the women gathered downstairs beside long tables filled with coffee pots, biscuits, and apple preserves. Clara moved quietly through the room, helping refill cups before anyone could ask her to. She carried herself with calm grace even when conversations softened the moment she passed nearby. Near the far wall, 3 older women stood together beneath a hanging lantern discussing her in voices low enough to sound polite and sharp enough to wound. I heard Ethan Walker has been spending time near the schoolhouse. Men get foolish during winter. Still strange seeing a rancher trail after a woman past her years. Soft laughter followed. One woman added, "A man like Ethan could marry somebody younger if he wished." Clara paused beside the coffee table for only half a second. Her fingers tightened slightly around the tin pitcher before she continued pouring coffee, as though she heard nothing at all. But across the room, Ethan had stepped inside moments earlier, and he heard every word clear as church bells. His jaw hardened beneath the brim of his hat. Before he could move, an elderly widow near the back suddenly swayed beside her chair. Gasps spread through the room as the woman nearly collapsed against the wall. Clara reached her first. She set the pitcher down immediately and knelt beside the widow without hesitation, steadying her gently while others froze in confusion. "Mrs. Holloway," Clara said softly, "look at me." Her voice stayed calm and warm. "You only stood too quickly." She loosened the woman's scarf carefully and asked for water while supporting her shoulders with surprising strength. Ethan watched the room change around her. The same women who whispered about Clara moments earlier now hovered nearby, uncertain and embarrassed, while Clara focused only on comforting the frightened widow. No anger, no bitterness, just kindness. Mrs. Holloway finally caught her breath and squeezed Clara's hand weakly. "Thank you, dear." Clara smiled softly. "You are all right now." The room remained quiet after that. Ethan stood near the doorway looking at Clara in a way he had not looked at anyone for years. Like he was seeing something honest in a world grown tired of honesty. But Clara never noticed him. She simply gathered the empty cups afterward and continued cleaning the tables alone while conversations slowly returned around her. Outside, cold wind swept dust across Main Street as Ethan mounted Diablo without speaking to anyone. He rode west beyond town limits and did something he had not done since the winter his wife died. That night, alone beneath the sound of creaking stable wood and distant prairie wind, Ethan Walker poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared into the darkness thinking about the woman everybody in Dry Creek misunderstood. The first snowstorm of the season arrived 2 weeks early. By late afternoon, the sky above Dry Creek had turned the color of old iron, while bitter winds swept across the plains hard enough to rattle shutters loose from buildings. Folks hurried home before dark, carrying sacks of flour and bundles of firewood beneath thick coats dusted white with snow. Ethan Walker had just finished securing the stable doors when he noticed Diablo pacing nervously inside the corral. The stallion hated storms. Always had. Thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the western hills, low and heavy like wagons crossing hollow ground. Ethan tightened the saddle straps on his horse and reached for the lantern hanging beside the barn. One of the younger ranch hands ran toward him through the snow. "Fence broke near Miller Ridge," the boy shouted over the wind. Diablo got out. Ethan froze. For 1 second he stared toward the darkening hills where snow already swallowed the horizon. Then he mounted immediately and rode hard into the storm. The cold hit like knives against his face while thick snow buried the trail inch by inch beneath the horse's hooves. Visibility dropped fast. 20 feet ahead became 10, then 5. Ethan pushed forward anyway because he knew what waited beyond Miller Ridge. Sharp rocks, narrow ravines, ice hidden beneath snow. A frightened horse could vanish forever out there. By the time he reached the old cedar crossing, the storm had become almost blinding. Then through the white haze he spotted another rider climbing the ridge ahead of him. Smaller frame, dark wool coat, Clara Whitmore. Ethan rode closer in disbelief. "What are you doing out here?" Clara pulled her scarf tighter against the wind without slowing her horse. "Your ranch hand told me the stallion ran toward the northern trail." Snow gathered in her hair and lashes, but her voice stayed calm. Ethan frowned hard. "You should be back in town." Clara looked ahead into the storm. "And leave you searching alone in weather like this?" Thunder cracked somewhere overhead. Their horses shifted nervously beneath them. Ethan wanted to argue again, but another violent gust forced both riders lower against their saddles. The trail ahead narrowed between steep rocks where snow drifted nearly knee-deep. Diablo's tracks remained barely visible beneath fresh powder. Together they followed them higher into the hills while daylight disappeared around them piece by piece. Hours seemed to pass in silence except for the sound of wind and breathing horses. Then Clara suddenly raised one hand. "Listen." Ethan stopped. Through the storm came a faint, distant whinny carried across the ridge. Diablo, trapped somewhere nearby. They dismounted carefully and climbed over frozen rocks until they found the stallion standing beside a narrow drop hidden beneath snow. The horse trembled violently, but remained still when Clara approached him slowly through the swirling white air. Ethan watched her place one hand against Diablo's neck again exactly the way she had that night in town. Calm, certain, fearless without needing to prove it. The stallion settled almost immediately beneath her touch. Ethan shook his head softly in amazement. "You really are not scared of anything." Clara gave a tired smile through the storm. "That is not true." Snowflakes melted against her cheeks while cold wind wrapped around both of them out there alone on the ridge. Ethan noticed then how exhausted she looked and how steady she remained anyway. Most men he knew would have turned back miles ago. But Clara Whitmore stayed. Not because she wanted praise. Not because anybody would even know she came. She stayed because somebody needed help. And somewhere beneath the endless sound of snow and wind, Ethan felt the lonely walls around his heart begin to crack just a little. The storm became too dangerous to ride through by nightfall. Snow buried the trail behind them until the world looked erased beneath endless white and shadow. Ethan spotted the old trapping cabin just before darkness swallowed the ridge completely. The place leaned crooked against the hillside with half its roof covered in snow and one small window glowing faintly from moonlight. Trapped in the ice, he led the horses toward the shelter while wind screamed through the pine trees overhead. Inside, the cabin smelled of old cedar smoke, damp wool, and forgotten winters. Ethan struck a match near the stone fireplace, and soon a small fire crackled weakly against the cold. Orange light flickered across the rough wooden walls while snow tapped softly against the window beside them. Clara sat near the fire warming her frozen hands slowly without complaint. Her cheeks were pale from the cold and strands of damp hair clung near her temples. But her posture remained straight and composed like she still carried a classroom full of children on her shoulders. Ethan removed his coat and draped it silently across the back of her chair. Clara looked up at him in surprise. "You will freeze. I have had colder nights." He crouched near the fire, adding another piece of wood. For a while neither spoke. The quiet inside the cabin felt different from the silence Ethan usually lived with. Not empty, just careful. Outside, wind rattled the shutters while Diablo shifted calmly beneath the lean-to shelter beside the cabin wall. Ethan glanced toward the storm through the narrow window. "You should not have come after me today." Clara watched the firelight move across the floorboards. "You would have done the same for somebody else." Ethan gave a dry smile. "Not many folks would believe that." "I do." The words settled softly between them. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the flames after that. Clara studied him quietly from across the room. Without the hard daylight and dust of town around him, Ethan Walker looked more tired than dangerous. Lines near his eyes, shoulders carrying years heavier than cattle work alone could explain. "Your wife," Clara asked gently after a long silence. How long has she been gone? Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. 5 years. Clara nodded once. She did not offer pity. Somehow that made it easier to answer. Fever took her during spring thaw. The fire cracked sharply between them. After that, Ethan continued quietly. The ranch got quieter every year. Clara stared into the flames. Loneliness can become a habit. Ethan looked at her. Then, the firelight softened her face in ways the hard daylight never did. For the first time he noticed how beautiful she actually was. Not the polished beauty town girls tried to carry at dances. Something steadier, warmer, like lamplight in winter. Clara slowly touched the gold ring hidden beneath her collar again without realizing it. The man I was engaged to once told me something, she said softly. Ethan waited. Her voice nearly disappeared beneath the storm outside. He said men want women who are easy to admire, not women who think too deeply. Ethan frowned. That is foolish. Clara smiled faintly at the floorboards. Maybe. Then after a pause she added, after enough years hearing it, a person starts believing they are difficult to love. Ethan stared at her across the fire longer than he meant to. The wind howled outside the cabin while shadows moved gently along the walls around them. Finally he spoke low enough that Clara almost missed it. Any man who made you feel unwanted was blind. Clara lifted her eyes toward him slowly. Neither looked away. The fire crackled softly between them while snow continued falling outside, covering the whole world beyond that little cabin in silence. The storm cleared sometime before dawn. By morning the hills around Dry Creek glittered beneath fresh snow, while thin smoke curled from chimneys across town and wagon wheels carved slow tracks through the frozen streets. Clara Whitmore returned to the schoolhouse before sunrise as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. She swept melted snow from the front steps, lit the cast-iron stove, and arranged arithmetic books neatly across each desk, while children slowly filled the room carrying cold red cheeks and wet boots. But all morning her thoughts drifted back to the little cabin in the mountains and the way Ethan Walker had looked at her across the firelight. Not with pity, not with obligation, with something steadier than either. Around noon, a polished black carriage rolled into Dry Creek, throwing muddy snow behind its wheels. Folks stopped in the street to stare because nobody wealthy ever came through town after winter began. The carriage door opened. Outside the hotel, and a tall man stepped down wearing a dark wool overcoat with silver buttons that caught the pale sunlight. Clean gloves. Fine leather boots. City money. The stranger removed his hat and looked around town with quiet disappointment already settled across his face. Good Lord, he muttered softly. This place truly has not changed at all. By evening, nearly everyone in Dry Creek knew his name. Henry Collins, Boston businessman, owner of several private schools back east. And once upon a time, the man engaged to marry Clara Whitmore. Ethan heard the gossip inside the feed store while buying oats for Diablo. They say he came all the way from Massachusetts looking for her. Rich too. Apparently owns property in 3 states. Makes you wonder why he ever let her go. Ethan stood motionless beside the grain barrels listening without expression. But something heavy settled low in his chest anyway. Across town, Clara sat stiffly inside the hotel dining room while Henry Collins poured coffee into delicate china cups brought west in padded crates. The dining room smelled of roasted beef and cigar smoke, while piano music drifted softly from the lobby nearby. Henry studied Clara carefully across the table. You look older, he said finally. Clara almost smiled at the honesty. So do you. Henry laughed under his breath. Still sharp as ever. He loosened his gloves and leaned back comfortably. I heard stories about you all the way in Denver. Schoolteacher taming wild horses in frontier towns. Clara lowered her eyes toward her untouched tea. People exaggerate. Not always. Henry paused before speaking again. I came because I have an opportunity for you. Clara looked up slowly. In Boston, a girls' academy near Beacon Hill. His voice carried the smooth confidence of a man used to being admired. Respectable salary. Private residence. Real culture. He glanced briefly toward the frosted hotel windows facing dusty Main Street. Certainly more than this town can offer you. Clara remained quiet. Henry softened slightly after a moment. You were always meant for more than prairie dust and lonely winters. Outside, Ethan rode slowly past the hotel on. Diablo just as warm golden light spilled through the dining room curtains onto the snow. He caught only a brief glimpse through the window. Clara seated across from a polished Eastern gentleman dressed finer than any man in Dry Creek. Ethan looked away immediately and kept writing without slowing down. But the image followed him all the way home through the frozen dark. Back inside the hotel, Henry reached into his coat pocket and carefully placed a folded train ticket beside Clara's teacup. "The train leaves in 12 days, he said quietly. "Come back east with me." Clara stared at the ticket while silence filled the room around them. Somewhere outside beyond the frosted glass, a horse whinnied softly in the cold night air. 3 nights later, the hotel ballroom, filled with more people than Dry Creek had seen all winter. Oil lanterns glowed gold against polished wood walls while piano music drifted through cigar smoke and perfume brought west in expensive glass bottles. Henry Collins had organized a formal supper before returning east, and half the town attended simply because wealthy men carried their own gravity. Clara Whitmore stood near the far wall wearing the same dark blue dress she reserved for church holidays and school ceremonies. Simple, elegant, her hair pinned carefully back beneath the warm lantern light. Yet no matter how refined Henry looked beside her, Clara still carried herself with a quiet dignity the expensive room could not improve. Folks watched them all evening. Some admired the idea of Clara finally receiving attention from a successful man. Others whispered that she would leave Dry Creek before Christmas and never look back. Ethan Walker almost did not come at all, but Reverend Miller stopped by the ranch that afternoon asking him to deliver extra barrels of cider to the hotel. Ethan agreed because saying no would have required more explanation than he wished to give. Now he stood near the back wall in a clean dark coat, smelling faintly of leather and cold air while townsfolk laughed around him. He looked painfully out of place beside polished shoes and Eastern manners. Clara noticed him the moment he entered. Her breath caught slightly. Before she looked away again, Henry followed her gaze and smiled politely. "That must be the cowboy everybody talks about." Clara said nothing. Throughout supper, Henry entertained the room with stories about Boston theaters, railroad investments, and private academies where governors sent their daughters. People listened closely because wealth always sounded impressive in small towns. Ethan remained silent near the cider barrels, helping refill glasses whenever needed. He never approached Clara once. Still, she could feel his presence from across the room like warmth from a distant fire. Then sometime after dessert, Henry lifted his wine glass and laughed lightly while speaking to several businessmen near the piano. "Life out here certainly builds character," he said. "Though I admit I cannot imagine spending every winter talking only to cattle and saddle leather." A few men chuckled politely. Henry glanced toward Ethan without cruelty exactly, but with the casual superiority of someone who had never questioned his own importance. "No offense intended," he added smoothly, "but frontier cowboys are hardly known for intellectual company." More laughter followed, this time louder. Ethan did not react. He simply lowered his eyes toward the empty glass in his hand while the room carried on around him. But Clara felt something inside her tighten sharply. For years she had stayed silent while people judged her, mocked her, reduced her to whispers and pity. Yet watching Ethan stand there alone beneath the lantern glow, absorbing humiliation without complaint, awakened something fierce and painful inside her chest. She set her fork down carefully. The sound cut through the room louder than expected. Conversations faded one by one until silence settled across the ballroom. Clara stood slowly from her chair and looked directly at Henry Collins for the first time all evening. "That cowboy," she said quietly, "has shown more kindness with silence than most educated men show with speeches." The room froze. Henry blinked in surprise. Clara continued before fear could stop her. "You speak beautifully, Henry. You always have. But Ethan Walker never once made me feel small in order to feel important himself." Nobody moved. Even the piano player lowered his hands from the keys. Clara's voice softened, then almost breaking beneath the honesty of it. "Do you know what that means to a woman who spent years believing she was difficult to love?" Across the room, Ethan finally lifted his eyes toward her. Their gaze locked through the warm, crowded ballroom, while every whisper in Dry Creek suddenly seemed very far away. The ballroom never fully recovered after Clara spoke. Conversations returned eventually, but softer now, uncertain around the edges, like everyone had suddenly realized they might have judged the wrong people all along. Ethan Walker left before the music started again. He slipped out into the cold December night without saying goodbye to anyone, boots crunching slowly through frozen snow while lantern light faded behind him. Clara watched him disappear through the hotel window and felt an ache settle quietly inside her chest. Henry Collins noticed it too. The next morning, Dry Creek woke beneath silver clouds and bitter wind drifting down from the mountains. Clara spent the day grading essays beside the schoolhouse stove while children practiced handwriting near the windows. Yet her thoughts stayed restless. She replayed Ethan's silence in the ballroom over and over. Not anger, not shame, just the same quiet dignity he carried everywhere. Near sunset, she stayed late organizing bookshelves while snow tapped softly against the roof overhead. That was when she discovered the envelope tucked beneath the classroom door. No name written outside, just folded cream paper worn slightly from cold fingers. Clara opened it slowly beside the lantern light. Inside sat a handwritten letter in rough, uneven script she recognized immediately as Ethan's. The words were simple, careful, like a man and used to explaining himself. Miss Whitmore, I am sorry for leaving without speaking last night. Truth is, I have spent years learning how to live alone. Makes a man forget how to stand near something good without fearing he will ruin it somehow. Henry Collins can offer you things I never could. Warm houses, fine cities, a future that looks easier than ranch, land and winter storms. But I hope someday somebody tells you the truth plain and honest. You are not difficult to love, not even close. Clara stopped reading for a moment because her vision blurred unexpectedly. She lowered herself slowly into the schoolhouse chair while the fire crackled beside her. There was more written beneath. I found something after the storm in the cabin. Figure it belongs to you. Folded carefully inside the letter rested a second piece of paper older and yellowed with age. Clara's breath caught instantly. It was a letter she wrote years ago after Henry ended their engagement in Boston. A letter never mailed. She remembered now leaving it accidentally inside an old book during the cabin storm when she unpacked her satchel to dry her belongings near the fire. Ethan must have found it afterward. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the page. The ink had faded, but the words remained painfully clear. Perhaps there is something wrong with me after all. Perhaps some women are simply too quiet for the world to notice and too thoughtful for men to keep loving once the novelty fades. I am tired of waiting for somebody to choose me without hesitation. Clara closed her eyes slowly after reading it. The loneliness in those old words felt like hearing the voice of a younger woman she barely recognized anymore. Outside the schoolhouse window, snow drifted gently beneath the darkening sky, while distant church bells echoed through town. Clara looked back toward Ethan's letter resting in her lap. Simple paper, rough handwriting, honest enough to hurt. Across town, Ethan sat alone inside the stable brushing Diablo beneath lantern light while cold wind rattled the wooden walls around him. He had no idea Clara was reading the letter now. Truthfully, he almost hoped she never would. Diablo nudged Ethan's shoulder softly while the cowboy stared out into the frozen dark beyond the barn doors. She belongs somewhere better than this, Ethan murmured quietly. The stallion lowered his head beside him while snow continued falling across Dry Creek in complete silence. The morning of the train departure arrived gray and painfully still. Snow from the previous night rested across Dry Creek in soft, untouched layers, while smoke drifted slowly from chimneys beneath the cold winter sky. Clara Whitmore stood alone inside the schoolhouse before dawn, running her fingers across the tops of empty desks one final time. Children would return after Christmas break expecting lessons and arithmetic and stories from books about distant oceans. But Clara did not know if she would still be there to greet them. Henry Collins had already arranged everything. The train tickets, the private rail car from Denver, a furnished apartment near Beacon Hill waiting beside the academy, a future polished clean of loneliness and prairie dust. Yet none of it brought her peace. On her desk beside the lantern sat Ethan Walker's letter folded carefully beside the old gold ring she no longer wore around her neck. Clara touched the rough paper once more before slipping it gently into her coat pocket. Outside, church bells echoed faintly through the frozen air. Across town, Ethan worked silently inside the stable brushing Diablo beneath the lantern glow. The stallion shifted calmly while Ethan tightened a leather bridle with slow, steady hands. He had not slept much. Every hour before sunrise felt heavier than the last. Part of him knew Clara deserved to leave Dry Creek. She deserved warm libraries and city lights and rooms where nobody called her unwanted behind polite smiles. Another part of him could not stop thinking about the way she looked beside the fire in that mountain cabin, or the way her voice trembled slightly when she defended him at the hotel. Diablo nudged Ethan's shoulder gently. Ethan exhaled and reached toward the small wooden peg near the stable wall. Hanging there was the black leather lead strap he used only for Diablo. Worn smooth from years of trust, earned the hard way. Ethan stared at it a long moment before finally taking it down. By noon, half the town gathered near the train platform wrapped in coats and scarves against the bitter wind. Steam drifted from the locomotive waiting on the tracks while conductors shouted luggage instructions into the cold air. Henry Collins stood beside the passenger car, looking perfectly composed in his tailored wool coat and polished gloves. Clara remained quieter than usual beside him, her suitcase resting near her boots untouched. Folks from town offered polite farewells while pretending not to watch her face too carefully. Then through the sound of the engine and blowing wind came the distant rhythm of horse hooves striking frozen ground. Ethan Walker rode into town on Diablo covered in road dust and melting snow. The entire platform seemed to notice him at once. He dismounted slowly without speaking and walked toward Clara while the black stallion waited calmly behind him. Henry straightened slightly beside the train car, uncomfortable now beneath the silence settling across the station. Ethan stopped in front of Clara close enough to see uncertainty trembling behind her composed expression. Neither spoke for several seconds. The cold air moved gently between them, carrying steam from the train into the gray sky above. Then Ethan reached into his coat pocket and placed the worn leather lead strap carefully into Clara's hands. Her breath caught softly. "This belonged to Diablo since he was a colt," Ethan said quietly. "Only thing he trusted for years." Clara stared down at the leather in disbelief because she understood immediately what the gesture meant. Ethan Walker owned very little he considered precious, and he had just handed her the thing his wild stallion trusted most in the world. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly before speaking again. "I figured," he said softly, "if you were leaving, maybe part of him ought to go with you." Clara looked up at him slowly while snow drifted through the station around them, and somewhere nearby the train whistle began to scream. The train whistle screamed across Dry Creek sharp enough to cut through the frozen air like grief itself. Steam rolled upward around the station, while passengers hurried toward the rail cars carrying luggage and wool blankets against the cold. Clara Whitmore stood motionless with Ethan Walker's worn leather strap still resting in her gloved hands. The black leather felt warm somehow despite the snow falling softly around them. Henry Collins stepped closer beside her, his polished boots already dusted white. "Clara," he said gently, "we need to board." She looked toward the waiting train. Beyond the windows waited Boston. Warm libraries, quiet streets lined with gas lamps, respectability, safety, the sort of life people spent years chasing. Then she looked back at Ethan standing alone beside Diablo beneath the gray winter sky. No promises, no speeches, just a tired cowboy who had spent months showing her kindness without ever asking for anything in return. Henry lowered his voice carefully. "You belong somewhere your mind is appreciated." Clara swallowed hard because part of her had once wanted exactly that. To be admired. Chosen. Finally enough for someone. But now another truth stood in front of her wearing a weathered coat and saying almost nothing at all. The conductor shouted for final boarding. Passengers climbed aboard quickly while steam curled around the platform. Henry extended one gloved hand toward Clara patiently. "Come with me." Clara stared at the offered hand without moving. Then slowly she looked toward Ethan again. He had not stepped closer, had not begged, had not tried to stop her. Somehow that hurt more than pleading would have. Ethan simply stood there carrying the same quiet sadness she first noticed beneath the lanterns weeks ago, like a man already preparing himself to lose something precious because he believed that was the honorable thing to do. Clara felt tears sting unexpectedly behind her eyes. Henry noticed immediately. "Clara." She finally spoke so softly only the two men near her could hear. "All my life," she whispered, "people kept telling me what sort of future I should want." The wind carried snow between them while the engine hissed heavily against the tracks. Clara looked toward the train once more. Then she stepped backward away from it. Henry blinked in confusion. "What are you doing?" Another step back. Clara's voice trembled now not with fear, but relief. For the first time in years, she said quietly, I think I finally know where peace feels like. The conductor called final boarding again. Henry stared at her as realization slowly settled across his face. Not anger exactly, just the understanding that some things cannot be argued away with logic or money or polished promises. He lowered his hand at last. You are choosing him? Clara turned toward Ethan fully then. Snow rested lightly against the shoulders of his dark coat, while Diablo stood calm beside him like the horse already knew the answer before anyone else did. Clara smiled through tears she no longer tried hiding. No, she whispered softly. I am choosing myself. The train whistle sounded one final time. Doors slammed shut along the passenger cars while Henry Collins stepped aboard slowly without another word. Moments later, the locomotive groaned forward through the snow, carrying warm lights east into the fading distance. Clara stood watching until the last rail car disappeared beyond the frozen hills. Then silence returned to Dry Creek once more. Ethan still had not moved. Clara laughed quietly through tears and shook her head at him. You really do not talk much, do you? A faint smile finally touched the corner of Ethan's mouth for the first time in years. He stepped closer slowly and took the suitcase from her hand without a word. Clara looked down at the leather strap still resting safely in her palm, while snow drifted softly around them beneath the pale winter sky. Winter finally loosened its grip sometime near the end of March. Snow melted slowly off the hills around Dry Creek until green grass pushed through the earth again and cold rivers swelled beneath the morning sun. The town looked different by spring. Softer somehow. Kinder in small, quiet ways nobody spoke about directly. Folks still gossiped over coffee inside the general store because people rarely changed all at once. But nobody called Clara Whitmore Old Maid anymore. Not after watching Ethan Walker look at her like she was something worth protecting without ever trying to own her. The new schoolhouse stood finished beside the eastern pasture where wildflowers now moved gently beneath warm prairie wind. Ethan built half of it himself during winter evenings after ranch work, hauling lumber through snow without complaint while Clara corrected school papers beside the lantern inside his kitchen. Neither ever announced what they had become to each other. They simply moved through life side by side, so naturally the town stopped questioning it after a while. On warm mornings, Clara opened the schoolhouse windows, and the sound of children laughing drifted all the way across Ethan's fields. Diablo often wandered near the fence line during lessons while students waved toward the great black stallion through the open windows. The horse never frightened anyone anymore. Not with Clara nearby. One bright April afternoon, Ethan repaired a saddle beneath the cottonwood tree outside the schoolhouse, while sunlight spilled gold across the grasslands around him. Clara stood inside teaching younger children their spelling words when little Emma Holloway raised one small hand from the front desk. Miss Whitmore. Clara smiled softly. Yes, Emma. The girl tilted her head thoughtfully. Why did you stay in Dry Creek? A few children looked up curiously from their books. Clara glanced out the window toward Ethan sitting beneath the tree with sleeves rolled to his forearms, rough hands working carefully through worn leather, while Diablo rested peacefully nearby. Wind moved softly through the grass around them. Ethan looked up at the schoolhouse then, almost sensing her eyes on him. Clara felt warmth spread quietly through her chest at the sight of him. Not excitement. Not the dizzy kind of romance novels promised young girls. Something steadier. Safer. Like finally reaching home after years of wandering through cold weather alone. She turned back toward the children and smiled gently. Because sometimes, she said softly, peace matters more than perfection. The classroom grew quiet after that. Outside, Ethan removed his hat and wiped dust from the saddle before standing slowly beneath the afternoon sun. Clara stepped onto the porch a few minutes later once lessons ended for the day. The wind carried the smell of fresh grass and pine through the valley, while church bells echoed faintly across town in the distance. Ethan leaned against the porch rail beside her without speaking. Clara rested one hand lightly over the worn black leather strap, still looped around the railing nearby. The same strap Ethan gave her at the train station months ago. A promise without words. Diablo grazed peacefully near the cottonwoods while children ran laughing down the dirt road toward home. Clara leaned gently against Ethan's shoulder. He hesitated only a second before resting one rough hand softly over hers. Neither spoke after that because nothing important remained left to say. Above them the sky stretched wide and endless over the western plains while golden sunlight rolled slowly across Dry Creek. And somewhere deep in the quiet spaces between loneliness and love, two people who had once believed they were too difficult to understand finally discovered how simple peace could feel when somebody chose to stay.